Maizatu, and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. I am Alexander Shin, and this is the last part of our conversation with Mulihay Talus, a Sakizaya activist and language revitalization worker. Currently, Mulihay is active as a radio host at Alian 96.3 FM, Taiwan's public indigenous radio station that broadcasts in 16 indigenous languages, as well as Mandarin Chinese. Mulihay, please tell us what inspired you to join Alian.
我目前是在阿里安原住民族广播电台担任节目组的企划。那其实在还没有来阿里安之前呢
I currently work at the Indigenous broadcasting station Alian as a program coordinator. Before coming to Alian, I hosted shows at various radio stations. I've been in broadcasting for over 20 years now, starting in year 2000. I remember it was around 2001 when the Typhoon Toraji hit Hualien. I had a lot of shows to host that day. I had one at 5 or 6 in the morning, another one in the afternoon, one more in the evening. And I also broadcasted news at night. At 11 p.m. and until midnight, I had a live show. So during the typhoon, I really wanted to inform my audience about the situation. I planned to have a live call with the mayor of Mulihay Township at 11:30 that night to update people on the typhoon's path. I had opened the call-in line, and at around 11:20, someone called me and said, "Is this the radio station?" I replied, "Yes." And he said, "We're in Daxing village in Guangfu. The rain is pouring down. Please come rescue us." And I thought to myself, it's already such a late hour. You should have asked for help earlier. I asked him if he had called the police, and he said he had called at noon, but no one had come. His house's windows were already flooding. I asked why he hadn't left, and he explained that he couldn't walk due to a disability, and his elderly parents couldn't leave without help either. I told him to hold on, and I would call for help. The time was nearing 11:30, so I jotted down his number and quickly connected with the mayor. After broadcasting the update on the typhoon in Mulihay, I finished my show and completely forgot about that call. It was a stormy night. I was alone in the station, and after the show, I hurried home. The next morning, when I arrived at the station, the doors were still closed, but there was a newspaper outside. You know what I saw? A picture of Daxing village buried in mud. My heart sank. I thought, isn't this the place that person called me from for help last night? I looked for the phone number, but I couldn't find it. Later, a group of reporters from Hualien went to that village to report on the disaster. Previously, I had worked as a substitute teacher at Daxing Elementary for about 3 months, teaching first graders. I used to stay with my students after school because most of them were being raised by their grandparents. So when I arrived in Daxing, I saw that the temple I used to visit with the children was almost completely buried, with just the roof peeking out. The entire village had been swallowed by mud. When I stepped out of the car, the ground was still warm and soft. I felt immense guilt for forgetting about the call for help the night before. I went looking for the homes of the students I had taught, but they were all gone, with just a few pomelo trees left. This was my experience as I started my broadcasting career, and it left a deep mark on me. Then, during Typhoon Morakot on August 8, 2009, I had a close friend who was indigenous but her husband wasn't. Though her children were half indigenous, they didn't know much about the culture. Without telling anyone, she sent her children to a cultural camp near Shaolin village. So after the typhoon, she lost contact with them. She was distraught. A few days later, her daughter did return, and she shared how they survived 7 days without food, water, or electricity. At the time, they heard on the radio that helicopters would drop food supplies, which gave them hope. This experience made me reflect on how essential radio is during disasters, especially in our indigenous communities, where there's often no internet or power. We only have the radio to rely on. This realization is why I eventually joined Alian. I remember within 6 months of joining, a major earthquake hit Hualien. I was the program director then, and I immediately organized an emergency broadcast. We worked around the clock for 3 days, connecting with local leaders, reporters, members of indigenous communities, and rescue organizations. At that moment, I felt like this was my purpose, helping my people in times of disaster. Now, whenever a typhoon strikes, we'll launch specific disaster prevention and rescue programs. This is why I came to Alian, and I hope our radio station can always be there to provide help when disaster strikes our indigenous homelands. I hope that everyone can stay safe and sound.
您这个地方需要我们做什么样的一个急救一个什么样的一个救灾一个防灾的方式。好，这就是我到阿亮来的一个目的了。但是希望说还是希望大家能够平平安安是最好了。
Now, I would like to, of course, ask you, who are the majority of your listeners? Are they the indigenous people of Taiwan? Or do you also have a mix of indigenous and non-indigenous listeners?
其实我们阿里亚原住民族广播电台，它是一个叫做任务型的电台。我们当初创立电台的宗旨就是希望能够。
Alian is a mission-oriented radio station. Our founding goal was to promote our languages and cultures and to provide disaster prevention and rescue information. Through this station, we want indigenous people to not only understand their cultures, but also revive our languages. Many indigenous people, even those from the largest Amis tribe, don't fully understand their own culture, so we use this platform to reach them. Another important aspect is breaking stereotypes. For example, people think the Amis Harvest Festival is just singing and dancing, but it's actually a 3-stage event. The Amis first invite the spirits from the holy mountain before dawn, then hold a feast to thank them for the harvest. Non-indigenous people only see this daytime celebration, but the festival concludes at night with a ceremony to send the spirits back. We hope that through this station, people who care about indigenous cultures will tune in and learn more. Ultimately, our mission is to revive our languages and promote our cultures.
但是我们的目的还真的就是，毕竟任务型的电台，族语一定要把它富裕起来，文化要推广出去，这是我们的使命了。
So, of course, there are 16 recognized indigenous communities in Taiwan. The question asks itself, how does Alian manage to represent all of these indigenous communities and languages in its broadcasting?
我们原住民有16族，好，那我们原住民族广播电台，看它的名字就是原住民族的广播电台，我们服务就是那16个族群。
There are 16 indigenous tribes in Taiwan, and as an indigenous radio station, we serve all of them. We broadcast in as many of these 14 languages as we can, although it's quite difficult. We have some programs starting from early morning, and we also have 5-minute news segments in various languages. It's challenging to, for example, find radio hosts from the Tao tribe of the Orchid Island, but we keep trying. Similar to how RTI broadcasts in many different languages, we collaborate with stations like the one on the Orchid Island to broadcast their shows on our station. We also work with other indigenous stations in Hualien, exchanging programs to make sure we represent the local voices and languages.
你就以在地的人来当你的主持人，那你的声音来跟我们做个交换，我们就是用这种方式来做。
Now tell us please about your program Alian 亮起来小牡蛎. What is the idea behind this program, and what can the non-indigenous society learn from this podcast?
OK， 我的母语其实是阿美语，但是呢，我们阿美族有5个语系。好，也说了，南是阿美，我是属于。
My mother tongue is Amis, but there are 5 Amis dialects: Nanshi or Northern Amis, Shogulan, Malan, Coastal, and Hengchun Amis. I thought they were all similar, but I discovered that my dialect of Northern Amis is quite different from the Malan Amis spoken in the Taidong County. So I invited a Malan Amis elder, who is a church pastor, to co-host with me. When we first started, I spoke Mandarin and he spoke Malan Amis. We wanted to make sure the show could be understood by a wider audience, so I used a bilingual format. This way, we could introduce Taidong's culture and tribes to everyone. It was a great experience.
用这种双语的方式，让大家可以走入到我们台东这个地方，来认识台东、台东的文化、台东的族群。我觉得是非常非常好的。对，
I'm really glad that you made it here today. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining me here.
今天非常谢谢 Oleg 邀请我来上我们的央广啊。那其实会认识他是在上个月的我们在曼谷的一个。
Thank you so much for inviting me to RTI. I first met Oleg last month at an international conference in Bangkok, and I've admired him ever since. Today's invitation allows me to share Sakizaya culture with your international audience. Thank you for this opportunity to represent Sakizaya and share our history and culture with your listeners. Dear listeners, if you ever come to Taiwan, please visit Hualien and our Sakizaya villages. Make sure to find me, and I'll be happy to give you a tour and help you understand our people's culture more deeply. Thank you.
让你更深入的了解好我们的一个族群文化。谢谢。
Gugai.
Gugai.
And thank you, our listeners, for being with us throughout these 3 episodes about the Sakizaya language and its speaking community. If you've enjoyed our series, please give us some boosts on social media and don't forget to recommend this program to others. And of course, do come back next week for another one of Taiwan's fascinating languages. Once again, this was In Taiwan We Speak. I am Oleg and see you next week.